Good afternoon, everybody. I imagine everybody will be coming in. We are here to have the last session, and we have had very good sessions during the day, but this one is going to be the best, obviously. So I have my good friend Pip here. We met yesterday, O'Keefe. He is Professor of Practice and Director of the Aging Asia Research Hub at cepar, so he will be the first speaker. He will be talking about experiences and challenges with asset-backed pensions in developing countries. Then we have two speakers that are going to be talking with experiences in developed countries. So we have Katja Mann, that she will be, well, she's from the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, and will be talking about some papers that she has in which they look at the effects on wealth and accumulation and inequality of the development of asset-backed pensions. So this is, from my point of view, a very, very interesting paper and the result. She is assistant professor at the Copenhagen. And then we have Werker from Tilburg University, a professor of finance and econometrics at the Tilburg University, and is going to talk about the recent, was approved 2 weeks ago or something like that, the pension reform in the Netherlands, and is going to try to solve many, many of the questions we have in mind about that reform in the Netherlands. So I think we have wide coverage of different issues on the importance of developing and promoting asset-backed, but I let the experts to explain to us. So, Pip.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I'm going to start with two caveats and one silver lining. The caveats are, as Pablo mentioned, I'm a professor of practice rather than a real professor, so you can call that a phony professor or whatever you like. It's important because you've heard a lot of interesting research and everything today, and in comparison, what I'll be covering is really quite simplistic and very descriptive rather than analytical. So it's a product disclaimer, I guess, of a professor of practice rather than a real professor. So they're my two disclaimers. The good news, though, is you've had a lot of material today and a lot to digest. So your brain needs a rest occasionally, and I think part of my function is to let your brain have a rest briefly before my two colleagues, real academics, speak again. So I'll talk briefly on this topic, firstly on context, secondly on some patterns we see in pre-funded schemes in developing countries, and I'll be focusing very much on DC design schemes and some common challenges, and then pre-funded schemes specifically for the informal sector, which are a more recent development. By way of context, I think this audience knows this story very well, but no matter what the funding type, pay-go, funded, partially, fully, coverage in the developing world remains a huge problem, and you see that on the left-hand side there, just that clustering of countries down in the left-hand side, the low-income countries with very low coverage of the working-age population. Perhaps more worrying is the picture on the right-hand side, which compares that coverage in 1990 with around 2015. And you see the picture has barely moved. So despite the fact that the developing world is, or parts of it are aging rather quickly, coverage, with a few exceptions, China, Turkey, really isn't budging. And that's a real concern given the demographics. Of course, what that reflects, and many of you from emerging countries know this very well, it's really a mirror of the labour market and these stubbornly high levels of informality that we see in the labour market. I guess the great hope kind of post-independence was that there'd be this steady formalisation of labour markets in the developing world, but for much of the developing world that just hasn't happened, with some, again, with notable exceptions. What that means is that this demographic developments, which are on the left there, that kind of share of aged population, which is increasing quite sharply in nearly all developing regions, that race between demographics and coverage is very clearly being won by demographics. Coverage is just not keeping pace with demographic change. So we'll have, even from today, about 1 billion more people in the developing world who are 65 or over by 2060. By 2050, 80% of the world's population 65 and over will be in developing countries, but we've got this stagnant kind of coverage story. So in that context, I'd like to start, and as I mentioned, this is mostly DC schemes. This is just kind of the broad typology. All of you will be familiar with this. I just make one general observation on this. While all of them were, of course, by their nature, focusing on retirement incomes to a larger or lesser extent, the emphasis of these different waves of reforms was somewhat distinct, or the things that came up in the political discourse was somewhat distinct. With provident funds, and that's pretty much all the former British colonies, except my own colony and my neighbouring colony, New Zealand, had these provident funds. But very much the emphasis there was kind of to establish a body, a deep enough body of capital to invest in infrastructure in the country. I think that was very much the primary motivation rather than retirement savings as such. So in lieu of capital markets, if you like. And you see that in many parts of the world that lack capital markets or lack deep or wide capital markets, that provident funds continue to be the dominant source of capital often for infrastructure. In contrast, the mandatory DC schemes, whether a pillar of a multi-pillar scheme or whether a single DC pillar, I think probably the story in Latin America and Eastern Europe and former Soviet countries was somewhat different. In Latin America, a lot of the emphasis, I think, was on the labour market formality, that somehow through the pension system we can drive formalisation. In labour markets where there's a lot of tipping back and forth between formal and informal, that maybe this would be the silver bullet that would kind of push things up and kind of stabilise formality and continue to increase it. In contrast, and we've got colleagues from Poland and elsewhere here who can speak much more knowledgeably on this, in different parts of Europe, Central Asia, I think it was, well, firstly, there was the fiscal collapse in many countries, so there was just a sense of desperation. We have to do something different. But there was also much more emphasis on the capital market catalysation, I think, of DC kind of reforms. And at times in the poorer countries in that region, quite a bit of emphasis or push, gentle push, let's say, from the IFIs in the direction of funding. And then finally, the voluntary informal schemes, which are still rather small, but I think an interesting new development that I'll talk about a bit further in. I think they're quite a different motivation again, very much coming from the kind of UN social floor, kind of rights-based approach in part, but also more an equity, financial inclusion, other kind of motives. So I think there are interesting distinctions, even though they share a common ultimate objective. I won't say much on this, but one has to always talk about governance arrangements at the beginning first. But for all these schemes, of course, robust governance arrangements and sustained political commitment are key. I think they're more key in funded arrangements than they were in or have been in DB arrangements. And perhaps even more so for informal workers, because they generally, as we'll see, participate voluntarily. So trust is perhaps even more important in the system. Despite all that, the political risk we've seen again and again in many of these countries, fund scheme reversals, dilutions, outright capture of accounts in countries like Argentina and Hungary, and quite a bit of politicisation of governance, which happens everywhere, but I think developing countries have been more prone to it. Within the informal schemes, it's a somewhat different problem. It's a politicisation problem, but it's a chopping and changing problem. So new governments tend to introduce their new subsidised scheme with their branding, and then the next government changes it somehow, maybe sometimes just rebranding, other times changing the design. So there's a lack of continuity as a result in the informal schemes. The other conditions for pre-funding, so a good collection mechanism and the capital market story, I think it's a diverse picture. The poorer the country, the harder the collection mechanism has been historically, but that's changing. And with the capital markets, I think it's a really varied picture. Sometimes there are capital markets which are accessed and used, and Chile or other countries are, good examples of that. Other times there are capital markets, but countries put one hand behind their back and don't access them fully for fiscal or other reasons. And other times there are just outrightly very shallow or absent capital markets. And then the final thing I would say, we've talked a lot about financial literacy today, but even more than in the developed world, reliance on competition to drive down costs or promote returns, promote efficiency in the system, I think has been not turned out as well as one would have hoped, let's say, and in an environment of low financial literacy and weak regulatory capacity. So I'd like now to switch to some more observational, just kind of fact-based things on these schemes. Coverage we talked about just before. But I'd like to focus on adequacy, and this has been, for the funded schemes, a huge problem and a pretty consistent problem in, I would say, nearly all countries. But it's for a variety of reasons, and the mix of reasons or the prominence of different reasons varies across country, and I'll go through some of those. For some countries, it's simply, it's a no-brainer, if you like, from the beginning, that contribution rates are just too low to ensure adequacy unless you have very high returns. So if you look there at Indonesia, Dominican Republic, to some extent Chile, this has been a perennial challenge. So here you almost know from the beginning that unless you have wildly optimistic return assumptions, you're going to struggle with adequacy. The second is inactive accounts, and given, again, this reflects, I think, the nature of labour markets, they're often very significant as a share of total accounts, and particularly for lower income groups and women. So on the left there you see, India, it's 20% of all accounts are active in the Indian EPF. In Malaysia, now Malaysia is almost a high income country. It's right on the border of upper middle income and high income. But nonetheless, 50% of accounts are inactive. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and the EPF there it's tried so many tricks to improve that story, but it just sticks, and it's still stays at around 50% active. If you then look at the distributional pattern, and that's on the right for a number of Latin American countries, not surprisingly, that inactivity of accounts is predominantly focused in the lower income quintiles. In the case of El Salvador, dramatically so, but that's a pattern you see in many countries. If you look at that on a gender basis, it's not quite as sharp as that, but it's certainly pronounced that women tend to be less active. Amongst the actives, then, density is the problem. So most countries, or many countries, are defining active as at least one contribution in the last year, which is not much, as you can imagine, one monthly contribution. There you see on the left, for a number of Latin American countries, across a career, the mean contribution density, and it's really very, very poor, even amongst the actives. And then on the right-hand side, this is the informal scheme in Vietnam. This is just for 1 year, but it gives you a sense of the kind of shares of people. So about 70% of the members of that scheme are contributing for 6 months or less during the course of the year. So these kind of figures, of course, are going to lead to huge density problems or adequacy problems by the end of one's career. The third or fourth element is early withdrawals, and we talked a bit about that. Olivia was talking about that with the COVID withdrawals in America and Chile and other countries. But I guess there's two things here. One is the COVID story, which exacerbated, but more is the underlying story that many of these countries, nearly all the Provident Fund countries and many of the others, allow fairly generous early withdrawals in their systems by design. This is putting the COVIDs and the like to the side. Some do it through deliberate, or sidecar accounts, account A, account B, one long-term, one short-term, others just through general rules on when you can draw down on your account for contingencies, hardship reasons. But what it means, it's really a fundamental part of the system. It's not just an emergency, kind of rainy day when you look at the numbers. If you look there at the pre-retirement withdrawals as a percentage of total withdrawals in any, that's for 1 year for Malaysia or Indonesia, 88% of withdrawals are early withdrawals for hardship reasons, which makes you wonder, is the point of the thing retirement income, or is the point of the thing shock, kind of consumption smoothing during working life rather than between working life and retirement? The Chile example, that's from an IMF paper. I'd be interested if our colleague from Chile would agree with those numbers, but Chile was just one of many countries that did, in COVID, had special withdrawals, and these were the IMF's estimates of some of the early impacts of that on replacement rates. This is a fairly modest effect from some of the other countries. I mentioned Malaysia, I was just there, and it's much more dramatic. They've had 4 rounds of withdrawals, and it's much more dramatic. Finally, I think the classic story with DC schemes of fees and returns. Fees, you see a lot of variations across countries, not always the ones you would expect. If you look at Turkey there, reasonably mature financial markets, big country, there's not necessarily the reasons why Turkey should be on the left-hand side of that picture. So fees are very variable, and returns, I think many of you know the story, that often driven by fiscal, the government wants the flow from the provident funds or their DC systems back to finance deficits, and that's probably one of the biggest constraints on the investment portfolio. And international diversification is far too limited in many cases, although with exceptions. And finally, I think we had a whole session on decumulation this morning, but just to say in the developing countries, I think it was lovely listening to all the talk of annuitisation and fine-tuning and things this morning, but really so many of them are still at the kind of lump sum stage and even lump sums during working life. So in Vietnam, for example, if you change job in less than 20 years of work history, you can take out your entire accumulation every time you change job, which is probably not a great idea for long-term savings. But for many countries, at the point of retirement, it's still lump sum. Now, that's partly due to the very low balances. If you've got an incredibly low balance in the first place, annuitising it is probably, polishing the wrong thing. The countries that do have it, though, and Chile is certainly an example we heard about before, it's happening, or others are considering it. I think the interesting thing is countries that are at lower incomes. Nigeria is one example that offers choice of a lump sum or some annuitisation or phased withdrawal. Virtually no one chooses the latter options. Everyone wants to take the lump sum. It's lack of trust in government, it's lack of trust in the long term. So I think this whole trust issue in developing countries is so much more pronounced when you talk about long-term savings, when you talk about things like annuitisation. It's really important. The informal schemes I'd like to talk about a bit just quickly. These have popped up over the last 10 or 15 years. They're voluntary, typically. They are in Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America. They're usually parallel informal sector schemes. In principle, some have portability with the formal schemes, but portability doesn't happen. They're normally DC and often with matches or sometimes hybrids, and typically government operated, often by the formal scheme operator, and they cross-subsidise administrative costs. So far, the take-up has been fairly modest. I give a few examples there, but it's a glass half full and half empty story. The absolute numbers go nowhere near filling the coverage gaps of the countries. At the same time, if you look on the right-hand side, the absolute numbers in proportion to the existing coverage of formal schemes is not always bad. India in its formal scheme has expanded coverage by 1 percentage point per decade since independence. So getting 5 percentage points in a decade in the informal sector is not all bad, despite it being completely inadequate. The one at the bottom there, I'd like to highlight Rwanda, because it brings in many of the features that these schemes have. It's got matching, it's bundling, long-term and short-term, it's relying on aggregators, and it's relying on leveraging digital platforms. And they are kind of the features that we see in different ways in all these schemes: matching, bundling, flexible design, leveraging, and aggregators. The matching varies. It can go from 10% to 100%. It varies as to whether it's an open-ended match from the government or, like in India and Vietnam, 4 to 5 year match. And it varies in structure. A country like China backloads the match. So you contribute relatively modestly to an individual account, but the payoff is a defined benefit from age 60. So it's basically 80% of your stream of income comes from that defined benefit, but very little research on the elasticity of that take-up. The bundling, I think, is obvious to this group. Health cover is the most common bundle, but you get countries like Benin there, which I think is a really interesting one, the most bundled. Pensions, health, microfinance, training, and different combinations of that. The flexibility, I think, is a matter of design at the top, so flat, tiered, flexible contributions, flexible periodicity of contributions, but probably more importantly, I think, the implementation. Simplified KYC, auto-enrolment, sometimes auto-debiting, and a vast expansion of contribution channels, whether it be mobile money, social media, convenience stores in Mexico, or many other approaches. And similarly, that kind of last thing of the entry points, aggregators also play a very important role, whether they are the actual collector or just the mobiliser of collections, whether they be industry associations, financial institutions, points of sale, telcos, mobile operators, etc. So a final word, I think, these are really interesting schemes. They're by no means a silver bullet to the problems we described at the beginning. But I think a lot of the innovations that are happening in those schemes are ones that can feed back to the formal schemes, and should much more feed back to the formal schemes to try and make some progress. Final point, though, is I think none of these schemes, formal or informal, can solve the fundamental issues of high informality, low and irregular incomes, and expecting pensions to change that fundamental reality is dreamland. And we've seen that in many countries. So don't expect the tail to wag the dog, I would say, really, on that. And then the final thing, because of the adequacy problems that we see in formal and informal schemes, or we will see in informal schemes, the coherence of these designs of any kind of funded scheme with the social pensions, which have expanded rapidly in parallel in many of these countries, is really key. Again, I've mentioned Chile too many times in this presentation, but Chile is a nice example of some interaction between the solidarity pillar of the system and the funded pillar of the system. It's not possible everywhere because that takes administrative capacity to get that kind of tapering. But at least thinking about the coherence of social pensions and funded pensions, particularly for the formal sector, is going to be fundamental, and more of that kind of joined up thinking, I think, would be very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Katja?
I hope you are indeed all rested now after what you promised, because now there will come a few equations, unfortunately. I hope you will be able to digest them despite the late afternoon. Okay, so this is joint work with some colleagues from Denmark, Sweden, and the US, and it's about the Danish experience in pension reform, adding a mandatory, or strengthening the mandatory pension savings into a funded pillar, and what is the effects on wealth inequality. So, I mean, we heard several times during today, for example, in Germany and some other countries, that pension reform is undergoing with the plan to add a funded occupational scheme to existing pay-as-you-go schemes. There are different reasons for that, for example, sustainability and demographic aging. But no matter what happens now is that households are more and more being mandated to accumulate savings during their working age, and then they're going to withdraw these savings when they're retired. So instead of where in the pay-as-you-go system you would have a pure transfer between generations, here it is like accumulating savings in an actual pension account. Now, this will, of course, have an effect on the level of savings of households, but it will also have an effect on the distribution of wealth. And that has not really been looked into so far, and that's where this paper comes in. So we look at the effect of the Danish pension reform on wealth inequality, on the one side in a theoretical framework, and then we do a case study using the Danish pension reform and also the great Danish data that we have available. So I said already that the pay-as-you-go scheme is a pure transfer scheme, so there is no really no asset positions involved there. So there's no wealth accumulation going on in a pay-as-you-go scheme. Whereas in a funded pension scheme, you have these explicit wealth positions. So now I'm just going to give you kind of the intuition for what that means for the wealth distribution and why it should lead to a more equal wealth distribution. Well, when you mandate households to save more, then all households should respond by lowering their voluntary pension savings. Or at least that's what theory says, and also empirical studies have found that maybe they do not offset this mandatory saving one by one, but they tend to offset to some extent. So they reduce their voluntary pension savings. And then it has also been shown that this happens to a varying degree across the wealth distribution. So rich households tend to offset more than poor households. So now when you look at the spectrum where on the one end you would have wealthy households, you mandate them to save more, but there is no effect on their total savings, no effect on their wealth, so they stay as before. On the other end of the spectrum, you would have households that either they're not financially literate or they're borrowing constrained, so whatever the reason, but they cannot fully offset or they will not fully offset the mandated increase in savings. So that means that at the one end, people stay the same. At the lower end, people have higher savings, and that will make the distribution more equal. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the story that we are telling here in this paper. And I should say right away, this is only about wealth that has an economic value. So in principle, you could also call pay-as-you-go kind of implicit wealth as like a wealth position. And then if you include this, you may get a little bit of different results. But because that is not really an explicit wealth position, and it's also not absolutely certain that you will get whatever the government promises you during working life, that you will actually get that during retirement. That's why we abstain from that. So we focus on Denmark, as I was saying, because on the one hand, Denmark had a pension reform in the early 1990s, and it's basically a textbook transition from a system that was mainly pay-as-you-go based towards a true multi-pillar system where the funded pillar will, when the system is matured, be the most important one. So here on the left-hand side, you see the contribution rates for different groups in the population. The gray lines are for public sector groups. So these ones already had a funded pillar to start with. So we're not really interested in them. We're not looking into these groups. But the lilac ones are private sector groups. And they had almost zero contributions in 1993, so when the reform started. And then it was increased gradually until about 2009 when it stabilized at roughly 12%. So it was a big increase in these mandated savings. On the right-hand side is the payments from the two pillars. So ignore the green line, but look at the other two. So the lilac line is the pay-as-you-go system, so the first pillar, and the payments made out of that pillar are still larger than the ones in the funded pillar as of today, but that pillar is losing in importance. So when you go forward around 2040, the funded pillar in gray will be the most important one, and it will stay so when the system fully matures, which will be towards the end of the century. Then at the same time, in Denmark, we have seen a decline in wealth inequality. So when we look at the Gini coefficient, which is one of the most common measures of inequality, that one dropped from 0.86 to 0.70 between 1993 and 2017. And that is in contrast to many other countries around the world where there was an increase in wealth inequality. So just to show you some data, on the left-hand side is the share of the top 10% of the wealth distribution, and on the right-hand side, the share of the bottom 50%. And the thick black line is Denmark, and you can see that the share of the top 10% was declining in Denmark over time. The share of the bottom 50% is increasing, whereas in other countries, I'm not sure you can see this, but we have the US, for example, France, the UK, there is an increase in the share of the top 10% and a decrease in the bottom 50. And we link this to the pension reform. And then finally, we have great data available in Denmark. So we have registered data on detailed wealth positions starting from 2014. So we see explicitly the amount that people have saved in their pension accounts, as well as other type of wealth. And so this is just great to study empirically the distribution of pension and non-pension wealth. But I don't want you to take this just as a case study in Denmark, because many other countries are in the process of undertaking similar reforms or discussing similar reforms. So I'm hoping that being a front runner, the Danish case can offer important insights also for policymakers elsewhere. So in this paper, we make 3 contributions. So first of all, we have a very simple model, and that's why I'm going to be spending some time on today to just explain the mechanism. Then we provide new stylized facts on wealth inequality in Denmark. And then we have a large-scale life cycle model where we have the pension reform, and we calibrate this model to Denmark. That part I'm not going to spend too much time on, but that model finds that we can explain the decline in wealth inequality in Denmark almost fully with the pension reform. So the design of the pension system really plays a key role for the wealth distribution in the economy. So now comes some equations, but I will gently walk you through it. So we have a model with overlapping generations. So you have people that live for 2 periods. So they're young, and then they're old, and then they're dead. And they earn an income when they're young, and then no income when old. So then they have to save in order to have some means to provide for themselves when they're old. So they can save into a safe asset that offers some fixed return R, and there is no borrowing. So what people would do, they would maximize their lifetime utility. So they would take into account their consumption when young and consumption when old. And the important thing that we introduce here is that people are different in terms of their level of patience. So some people are more patient, so they put more emphasis on consuming when they're old, whereas other people are more focused on consuming when they're young. So they're more impatient, they're really more focused on the presence. What that means then is that there will be differences in the savings level. So if this is the only thing where people differ, it means that those ones that are more patient will want to save more. So they will accumulate a higher wealth position than people who are more impatient. Now, this has also been found empirically that there are actually big differences in patients. So this is not something that we come up in this theoretical framework, but it's actually something that holds true also in the real world. Now, that means in such a world where we have people with different patience levels, there will be a distribution in wealth, and so therefore we could create some kind of wealth inequality measure there. Now, what happens if we add to this a pension system? So let's first focus on the pay-as-you-go system, where we make things, again, very simple. We just say people pay some taxes too, and when they're old, they receive the same amount. So yeah, just keep the world as simple as it is. Then what will happen that people, when they make their decision about how much to save for retirement, they will take into account that they will get this money when they're old. So when young, they pay the contribution, but they also know that when old, they will get the payment from the pension system. People will then offset this increase in this mandatory contribution by saving less privately. This is what I talked about earlier. And what we can show is that when you make these contributions sufficiently large, there will be people who will not want to save any more privately at all. So they will be, just when they're old, they will just get the pension income from the pay-as-you-go system and nothing beyond that. And we can call this threshold value, so there will be one kind of value that divides people into those that are still active savers and those that do not save, and so we can characterize that, and that will be relevant a little bit later on. But importantly also, because this payment from the pension system is not a wealth position, there will be these people, these very impatient people, who hold zero wealth, right? Now, if we then go to the funded pension system, so again, same setup, they pay some contributions tau. When they're old now, they receive something more, because this money is invested and earns a return. So this will be R times tau, right? And here now this is not just an income, but it's also a wealth position. Because you have your pension account, the money is sitting on the account, it's your private wealth. Here in this setup, this offsetting effect will be even stronger because the people, in people's perception, the income that they get from the pension fund will be exactly equivalent to the income that they would be getting when they invest privately, because the return is the same, right? And again, we can do this experiment where we make this contribution rate higher and higher, and at some point, there will be people that are driven into this, what we call zero savings corner, so there will be people who do not save outside of the pension system anymore. So again, we can derive a threshold value, and that threshold value will actually be a little bit higher than as a pay-as-you-go system, so there will be more people, they do not find it worthwhile to save privately because they get this return also on the funded savings. So that's why the difference. But still the more important difference here is really that we have in one system people that are saving at the very bottom of the wealth distribution or the income distribution or in pensions distribution in this case, whereas in the other system, these people do not save at all. So that's what we show on the left side graph here. That's the total savings by level of pensions. And you can see on the red line, that's the pay-as-you-go system. And then in the dark solid line is the funded system, and the dotted are this laissez-faire, so without any pension system. And the one thing, as I said, there are these differences in the cutoffs, but they're really not that important. The more important thing is here really that there are some people that in the pay-as-you-go system don't save at all. In the funded system, everyone saves, but at some point, all the lower part is flat. That just means that these people do not save more than they have to save. It's only after a certain point that they start saving on top of what the pension system makes them save. And on the right-hand side is the Lorenz curve, so measure, graphical representation of the wealth distribution, where the closer you are to the 45-degree line, the more equal is the distribution. And as you can see here with the funded system, you have a more equal distribution. I mean, assuming certain parameter values, but those are kind of the realistic ones. Okay, so much to the theory. So now I'm gonna show you some graphs and some empirical findings that we got. So we're looking at the wealth distribution in Denmark now. And just to tell you what we're doing, so we're measuring wealth as net wealth. So it's all the financial assets minus liabilities. We do not have information on durables, so that part is excluded. But otherwise, there is housing, other non-financial assets, as well as financial assets. As I said already that we only include marketable wealth, we do not include implicit social security wealth. And that's in line with OECD standards. Then when we have households with several adult members, we would just merge all their wealth together and then divide it by the number of people in the household, just assuming that everybody has their equal share in the wealth position of the household. We have to exclude entrepreneurs because they're not covered by the mandatory pension scheme, so they're one of the few groups that are actually left out. And I said we have great data starting from 2014. Before that, we have to make some imputations, so it's a little bit trickier, but it's still, I guess, better quality data than in many other countries. And the nice thing with the Danish data is also that we can link the wealth information with other types of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that we also have in the registers. And this is what the life cycle, it's a cross-section, but it's the distribution of wealth by age groups in 2017. So this is what it looks like. Let me walk you through this. So on the below zero, we have the debt. So there's mortgage debt is the biggest share, and then you have some other kind of debt that's not so important. And mostly indebted are people around their 30s, 40s. And then on the asset side, you have housing in the green color, which is the most important asset for younger people. And then the other big part, and actually the most important saving or the most important asset position here for the households around retirement age are the pension assets in this kind of more blue-greenish color. So even though the system is not yet fully matured, it's already the case that these pension assets are super important in the household portfolios, and they are really the most important asset for the people around retirement age. Then what happens afterwards is they withdraw, and some would then shift their money into other type of financial assets, but bear also in mind that these are different cohorts, so the people that are older most of them have not really paid much into the mandatory funded pension scheme. Okay, and then also the same graph as I showed you before from the model. So when we look at the Lorenz curves, or measure of wealth distribution, we can see ones with and without pension systems. The solid line is with pensions, the dotted line is without pensions, left is for the whole population, and right is for the 60 to 69-year-olds. And you can see that when you include the pension system, the pension assets, then the distribution becomes more equal. And this is even more the case for the people in the 60 to 69-year-old group, who are the ones where pension assets matter the most. Right? Okay, then we have a big model, and I'm not going to give you all the details of that model. That would take another hour, I guess. I'm just going to give you a snapshot. So here we really have a detailed life cycle profile where people spend a certain number of years in working age, and then they spend a certain number of years in retirement, and they make their savings decisions over their whole life cycle. We have stochastic survival, so people may have a certain chance of dying every year. And we make people different not just by the time preferences, so what I showed you before in the small model, but we also give them different labor income processes. And so then we end up with people having very different wealth levels in the model, even without any pension system. Then we introduce pension systems, so we have these two pillars. We have pay-as-you-go, which is tax finance in Denmark, and we have the funded system, which we gradually introduce. And we have some other elements that are not super important. We then calibrate the model, so the way we do it is, you start from a steady state, you go through the transition, you go to new steady state. So we do this very carefully by looking really into the micro data, so what I showed you just before, and trying to bring the model as close to the data as possible. We also have to calibrate all these different preferences and all that stuff. And then what we get on the left-hand side is the profile. So this is for a representative individual in 1992. And on the right-hand side would be that a person in 2017. And you can see the light gray part is the pension assets, so the ones that you have to save, and they increase by quite a lot over that time, whereas the other part, the voluntary savings, they did not increase by that much. This is the wealth distribution. So we have targeted the number on the very left, so where the 60 to 69-year-olds in 1992, there the model and data are exactly in line, which is how we calibrated the model, so how we designed the model, basically. And then we can see that when we switch to 2017, there is a decline in the data to 0.51, and in the model we almost get as far. So the pension reform explained a significant share of that decline in the wealth distribution. And when we look at the full population, there's also a decline in the Gini coefficient over time, and we actually overpredict a little bit. There can be different reasons for that, but also there we see that if you model a pension reform, you get to quite a decent reduction in the dispersion of wealth. I think I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, and we look at a little bit in kind of behavior of different types of households, and like why do some people offset, why do other people not offset. Anyway, one thing I just want to very briefly talk about are the welfare implications, because if the distribution of wealth becomes more equal, that does not necessarily mean that everybody is better off. So it might be that there are some people, I said in the beginning, the people at the lower end of the wealth distribution, they are the ones that are now mandated to save more than they otherwise would, and maybe they're not that happy with it. So maybe they were fully rational before, and now we're forcing them to save more than they actually would like to do, especially for young people, right? So you have to pay these relatively high contribution rates in Denmark when you have just entered the labor market. They may not be optimal. I mean, when we look into this, we find that consumption inequality, so that could be a measure of welfare effects, does not really increase dramatically. So it's also not really getting any better, but in that sense, it doesn't seem to be, at least, that there's groups of the population that are like really worse off through the pension reform. Yeah, I'm going to leave you with the conclusions, but I mean, this is, as I said, I mean, Denmark it's one of the countries had, I guess, the largest pension reform, but at the same time also ranked as one of the best pension systems in the world. And so I hope that this pension reform can also serve as a blueprint for other countries, and that this paper will hopefully inform about the wealth consequences of that.
Thank you very much, Katja. Bas, your turn.
Thank you, Pablo. So now we go from the best pension system in the world to the second best pension system in the world, or vice versa, depending on which year you do the calculations. And so I have a very difficult task here because I have to. I was asked to talk about the Dutch pension reform, which indeed was passed into law formally about 2 weeks ago. But then most of you probably know that writing and passing a law is the simple part, then executing it and implementing it is the hard part. So that's what I would like to talk about. So let me first give you a brief overview of what the current Dutch retirement system is. So there is a first pillar, which is purely pay-as-you-go, and that's about 1,000 euros a month for everybody, non-means tested. As long as you have lived in the country, you will get it. And there actually nothing changes. What has changed over the past few years is that the mandatory retirement age has increased significantly. So we're now at 67, 68, and if you look at the predictions in the Netherlands, the retirement age is linked to the life expectancy. I probably will retire around 70. Okay, so being here in France, maybe that's something to look at, maybe. Anyhow. Then we have also the second pillar, and that's what the reform is about. And the second pillar is occupational pensions. And for the average Dutch person, that's also about 1,000 euros a month in the decumulation phase. But there's lots of heterogeneity. Yeah? So there are some people that have zero, and there are some people that have way too much. It's important to realize that it is fully funded and large. Now, the Netherlands is a small country, but it's 1.5 trillion euros, so that's about a bit less than 2 times GDP. And premiums are about 25% of salaries, or up to 25% of salaries. And that's, in that respect, it's a significant amount. And the origin of that system is purely DB. And what I've realized over the past few years, and also here, is that when people use the term DB or DC, they may mean very different things. What I mean here when I say DB, that is that the entitlements are presented to you as a lifelong income as of your retirement age. Yeah, so that's an annual income that you are promised. DC is, of course, based on you accumulate wealth and then we'll see what the returns bring. But in the Netherlands, you have to realize that there is compulsory annuitization, there's hardly any choice, there is mandatory participation. So if you want to think about, if you have questions about the Dutch system, if you ask yourself, is something mandatory, then assume that the answer is yes. And if you have a question, is something allowed, then assume that the answer is no. Then you have a pretty good description of the Dutch system. So it's extremely strict. And all those things actually don't change. Yeah, so it will still be mandatory, there will still be full annuitization, very limited choices. And what was the system? It was originally DB, but effectively the past few years it functioned more or less like a CDC system, where the funding ratio was calculated, and if the funding ratio of a fund was above 150%, pensions would go up, and if the funding ratio was below 90%, pensions would be reduced, and in between you don't do anything. So that's the second pillar, and then there is a smaller third pillar, which I will not talk about, and there are also not too much changes. Now, as I already said, I have to convince you why we think we have a problem, being the best or second best pension system in the world. So we have extremely low poverty among the elderly. There's absolutely nothing to worry there. I mean, the only group in the Netherlands which may have a problem are immigrants which don't have a full first pillar pension since they have not lived in the Netherlands for 40 years. We have high funding ratios. They are, again, way above 105%, and even at the lowest point in the past few years, they were above 90%. And that was not due to artificially high discount rates for the DB system, because we always valued things at the risk-free rate, even when they were negative. So from this perspective, it's extremely difficult to explain to foreigners why we think we have a problem. But what was going on? So in the past, pensions were always not formally. If you talk to lawyers, they say, well, we never said this. No, that's true. But if you looked at simply communication of pension funds to participants, it was always sold as a, don't worry, guarantee, inflation-protected product. Yeah, so you will be fine when you are retiring. And if you look at what actually happened over the past 15 years, is that pensions had not been increased And so that means that in real terms, pensions have been reduced by 25%, which again was according to the rules, but was not in line with the perception. And there was constantly discussions about the discount rate. So what is the discount rate in order to value liabilities? And so the political arguments were a bit like elderly said, yeah, but we were promised in the past this high pension, and it should be inflation indexed, hence it has to be increased. And then they said, okay, if we increase the discount rate, we can also increase the pension payments. And other groups who say, yeah, but if you do that, then you simply shift money from the younger generation to the elderly generation, and we don't like that. But there was always a very technical debate, and you can imagine that is very difficult to solve. So these were the things which were going on, and for 15 years there have been discussions, and a few years ago we have been asked, and actually, and that was a very nice experience, more or less, what would you do if you would design the system from scratch, given that there should be full annualization going on, so actually we are very close to the tontines that have been discussed earlier. There is mandatory participation, rates premiums remain the same, and so on. So that's what I said. So what we do is we keep mandatory enrollment, limited individual choices, lifelong pensions, longevity risk sharing, but what we change is actually the way we administer pension entitlements. So it will no longer be DB entitlements in the sense you are promised this and this amount as of retirement for the rest of your life, but we administer it as a DC account. Now, I'm hesitant to call that an individual account because you cannot touch it, you cannot take out money beforehand, you have a very limited possibility to take out money as a lump sum at retirement. You have no investment choice that you can make. You cannot decide on the premiums that you pay in, etc. Yeah, so it's an individual account. I would say no. It's simply an administrative unit which is measured in terms of wealth instead of future income. And then what we will do is we will have explicit risk-sharing rules, much like the tontines that have been described with respect to longevity risk, but at the same time also financial market risk and market-consistent valuation. And market-consistent valuation here means that the politicians agreed that if you take on financial market risk, which of course you do if you have a funded system, that the allocation schemes should be such that the risk and the risk premium that comes with the risk is always allocated to the same person. Yeah, so it's not allowed that we allocate the risk premium to the, let's say, the elderly and the risk to the young people in the fund, which is may seem a very reasonable restriction, but in many countries, if you look at funded systems, that condition is not satisfied. In any case, it's a political choice. So then, I mean, we discussed this for 15 years. The law, including all documents that go with it, was over 1,000 pages, I think, or even 3,000 or 4,000 pages. There have been 800 questions in Parliament about how everything was going to function. So I'm trying to explain all this to you in one slide. And the way I think of it myself is by asking myself the question, why is a pension fund different from a mutual fund? In a mutual fund, you also put in money. That money is pooled, it's invested collectively, there is a mutual fund return, and then you allocate that return to all the individual accounts. And in a mutual fund, that's very obvious, and actually it's so obvious that people usually don't think about it. If the collective return on the fund is plus 3%, everybody gets plus 3%. And if the collective return is minus 6, then everybody gets minus 6. Now, if you would do that in a pension fund, then you actually get very bad outcomes if you think in terms of income. Because the relationship between wealth and income is affected by many things. If you have new survivor tables, there will be a different relationship, how much money you need for a certain income. If interest rates change, there will be a different relationship between how wealth transforms into income. And so what is essentially the technicalities that we do is we design a system where the returns are distributed equally over all the participants, but with the very important comment that equally does not mean equally to all the wealth numbers, but equally to the actual income or the projected income. So if there is a financial market shock, and let's say it's a positive shock, then all incomes of all the retirees will go up by 1%. And for the younger generations, their projected pensions will go up by 1%. If there is a negative shock, can also be a longevity shock, people at some point live much longer than we had anticipated before, Then there will again be redistribution of that over the individual accounts, the wealth accounts, such that the effect of the income is for everybody the same. And that's actually, if you write down the equations, not too difficult to solve. I mean, people in finance have solved that already, and they would call that hedge returns and excess returns if you think about standard investment lifecycle strategies. And if you approach it more from a risk-sharing perspective, you can go back to the old papers by Borg in the 1960s, where you say, okay, we have a Pareto efficient allocation of the risks, such that with respect to income it is Pareto efficient, but not with respect to wealth. And actually that may pose problems in the future, because will people understand that if the fund return is plus 6%, you allocate 12% to some people and only 3% to others? I mean, that's a question that you have to answer. Of course, that's also what is being done in many other existing situations elsewhere. It was also what implicitly was done in the Netherlands, but if once you become explicit about it, it may lead to other questions. And so how do you do that? Individuals' wealth receives annually actually two returns. The first return is what you could call a hedge return. And it would simply be the return that you have to allocate to an individual account, such that if you will only get that, your income would remain constant for the rest of your life. So if you are, let's say if you are 100, you have a life expectancy of 1 year, then of course the payment that you will receive will about be the same as your wealth that you have in that account. So if you are, so let's say, unhappy that you live again at the end of the year, still at the end of the year you would be out of a pension income, but that's not what we do. I mean, we're going to then share that risk, and so the person will simply get a hedge return which is equal to another year's payment, and like that the person will keep a lifelong payment. So that's the way the toteens work, but we do the same thing with interest rate risk, we do the same thing with stock market risk and so on. Now if you add all those returns that you have to allocate in order to keep the pensions constant, you compare that to the actual return of the pension fund, there will of course be a difference. Because you will never, the realized returns will never equal to the expected returns. You may have used the wrong longevity tables. People may have died more often than even than you expected. And financial markets have done something else than what you need in order to keep pensions constant. And that will be simply equally shared over all the accounts, taking into account human capital, future contributions, such that, as I said, the effect on the incomes is for everybody the same. So that's the way the new system will work. Then, some observations on how the scheme works, if you look at this from a, let's say, more academic point of view. I mean, so the previous was the way the system was designed. If you think about how this will work out in practice, you can have two views. On the one hand, you can say it's a type of DC system. All of the world knows how DC system works. Actually, we also have the more classical individual DC system as well in the Netherlands, but that's much smaller. There is actually no, well, one observation is that in the political debate I found it very interesting. So at the beginning these were two very different systems, and if you go through the process, ultimately there are now two things, and if you ask me what is the difference between the two schemes, I wouldn't know. I mean, it grows together because you get some of these political discussions where somebody says, yeah, but if I'm allowed to do this in the other system, I should also be allowed to do this in this system. And then my question is always, but if you're allowed to do everything in both systems, then what's the difference again? So that's an observation on how the politics worked here. But anyhow, I mean, it's a classical DC scheme. This will work. I mean, there's no reason why it will not work in the Netherlands while it will work everywhere else. Then there is something where I'm extremely worried about, and that is what we will have in the future is this new system, but of course we also have existing entitlements in the old DB type system. And it has been decided that there is mandatory conversion of those existing rights from the old system to the new system. And I have written here, unlike any other reform I know of, but I mean, Pip already said that he might know of one where it has been done, but we'll see. If you know anything anywhere, I would be very interested to know, where you have mandatory conversion of the, so not voluntary conversion, I can imagine that, but mandatory conversion of the existing rights in the old system, the DB type system to the DC type system. And why do I fear that that will lead to lots of problems? Because how are you going to value these old rights? I mean, even if you would agree on the discount rate to use, which is of course already a problem, what do you do if you have a funding ratio of 110%? Because then you have a 10% surplus. How are you going to allocate that over all the individuals? Or even worse, if you have a 10% deficit, how are you going to allocate that? At the same time, there will be many changes which are smaller from the international perspective, but actually for some people they may be very important. So people may argue, yeah, but wait a minute, I don't get compensated for this change, and you do compensate that person for that change. So you can get lots of discussions. At some point, the government tried to solve that more or less by having extremely complicated value-based ALM methods with risk-neutral valuations that only people with a PhD in quantitative finance understand. I don't think that will work, but we'll have to see how that pans out. And then you have to value all these embedded options. So this is something that is currently in the law. I'm not sure we will actually do that once people realize what kind of discussions this leads to. So this is what we are currently thinking that we are going to do. Observations on that conversion, and that is just more like a political observation from a scientist, is that this conversion of the existing rights to the new DC rights always has been framed by the politicians as a technical and a scientific problem. So that was, if you scientists help us valuing those rights, then we're just going to tell everybody science says it has to be done this way. I've always said, and ultimately that worked more or less, that of course this is a redistribution question, and that's inherently a political question. One argument that I did not mention yet, but which also has been used, if you say that the new system is better than the old system, and if you don't say that, then why do you want to go to the new system in the first place? Then you also say that people that have spent a long time in the old system apparently are disadvantageous against versus people that are only very young and can have benefits of the new system for a long time. Yeah, so you can have all kinds of arguments that play a role there, and so there are many people that expect lots of court cases there. Court cases, this is a typo, court cases. And so I think that we should seriously consider to maybe even have default conversion. If you don't say anything, it will be converted, but in any case, give people an opt-out. Okay, that's was what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the closing.
Okay, it's a time to conclude our 3-day meetings, which is finalized this, or finished with this excellent seminar. Normally it looks like the 3 days of the full of the agenda is too exhausted, but I'm so sure that everybody heard that if you meet good people and if you have a great agenda, the time is running. And my feeling is that these 3 days was really the time when time was running, and we spent the time with excellent discussion, comments, conversation. And I would like to thank you also the OECD, IPRA, and IPRA for organizing this seminar. The topics was exactly great. I'm happy that we are following by the cocktail, and we will continue with the questions. And one more time, I think that I can say on the behalf of all our community that it was a great deal. Thank you.
Let me just share what Julia said, and I don't want to add anything. We are conscious that we are the only obstacle between you and the cocktails, as you usually said. Anyway, I just want to repeat what also Serdar was saying this morning, that it is remarkable that with no, probably, or with little effort of coordinating the agenda of our meetings, of the supervisors and the regulators of OECD and IOPS, was very similar to the agenda of this workshop, academic workshop today. So thank you very much for really being on the issues that are relevant, and I'm sure that this exercise of converging on the same topics will be fruitful for the future. We have so many things to discuss, and we look forward to future cooperation. Thank you.
And with that, it is closed. Thank you very much.